One evening, a new visitor came to Thornfield Hall. He was a quiet young man with dark hair called Mr. Mason. He came to see Mr. Rochester on business. Mr. Mason told us that he and Mr. Rochester were old friends. But Mr. Rochester was not very pleased to see Mr. Mason. When Mr. Rochester heard the name Mr. Mason from the West Indies, he was surprised and his face turned white. That night, Mr. Rochester and Mr. Mason talked for a long time. At last, very late at night, they went to bed. Soon, everyone in the house was asleep. Suddenly, I woke up. I heard a terrible scream from somewhere over my head. Then, everything was very quiet again. I listened carefully, and then I heard a lot of noise from above my head. There seemed to be fighting in the room above. Then there was another scream. "Help! Help!" someone shouted. There was more fighting then a voice called out, "Rochester, come quickly! Help me!" A door opened, and I heard someone running up the stairs to the attic. I quickly put on some clothes and opened my door. Everybody in the house was awake now. The visitors were all standing outside their doors. "What's happening? Is there a fire? What was that noise?" they asked. Mr. Rochester came down from the attic. "Please don't worry," he told his friends. "Everything is all right." "But what's happening?" somebody asked. One of the servants had a bad dream and started to scream. Mr. Rochester said, "But everything is all right now. Please go back to bed." Slowly, all Mr. Rochester's visitors returned to their rooms. I too went back to my room, but I did not go back to bed. I sat and looked out of the window. The house was very quiet now. There were no sounds from the attic. Then someone knocked on my door. I opened it. Mr. Rochester stood outside. "Jane, come with me, please," he told me, "but come quickly and quietly. Follow me." I followed Mr. Rochester up to the attic. He unlocked the door of a room and we went inside. "Wait here," Mr. Rochester told me. I stood next to the door. There was another door on the opposite side of the room. From behind this door I could hear a terrible sound. It was like an angry animal. Mr. Rochester left me and went through this door. Once again, I heard that terrible, cruel laugh. Was Grace Polly behind the door? Mr. Rochester spoke to someone inside the room and then came out and locked the door again. "Come here, Jane," he told me quietly. I came further into the room. There was a large bed in the room. Mr. Mason was lying on the bed. His face was white and his eyes were closed. There was a lot of blood on his shirt. He did not move. "Is he dead?" I asked. "No," answered Mr. Rochester. "He isn't badly hurt, but I must go and bring the doctor up for him. Will you stay with him until I get back?" The man on the bed moved. He tried to speak. Mr. Rochester turned to him. "Don't try to talk, Mason. Jane, do not speak to him, please. There must be no conversation between you." Mr. Rochester hurried out of the room. I waited for him with the silent man on the bed. I was frightened. I knew that Grace Polly was in the next room for a long time. I waited for Mr. Rochester to return. When will he come back? I asked myself. At last morning came and Mr. Rochester returned with the doctor. While the doctor was looking after Mr. Mason, Mr. Rochester spoke to me. "Thank you for all your help, Jane. Mason is going to leave Thornfield Hall now. The doctor will take him away," he told me. We helped Mr. Mason down the stairs and out of the house. It was still early, and the other people in the house were still asleep. "Take care of poor Mason," said Mr. Rochester to the doctor. "Soon he will be able to go back home to the West Indies." Before he left, Mr. Mason said something very strange. "Look after her, Rochester," he said. "Promise to look after her." Mr. Rochester looked sad. "I promise. I will always look after her." I started to go back to the house. "Don't go, Jane," said Mr. Rochester. "Come into the garden. Talk to me." We went into the garden. "What a night," he said. "Were you frightened, Jane?" Yes, I was frightened up there in the next room. There was someone. That terrible laugh. Mr. Rochester, will Grace Polly go away now? No, he replied, but don't worry about Grace Polly. Try to forget about her. She isn't dangerous. It is Mason, and I am worrying about him. I was surprised to hear this. Mr. Mason? But he is frightened. He can't hurt you. Mr. Rochester looked sad. I know Mason doesn't want to hurt me, but he could say something that will hurt me. I shall be happier when he goes back to the West Indies. Later that day, I got a surprising letter. Mrs. Reed, my aunt, was dying and she wanted to see me. It was a long journey to her home. When I got there, I heard that my cousin John was dead. Mrs. Reed was very ill. At first, she did not want to speak to me. Then one day, when I was sitting by her bed, she showed me a letter. It was from my uncle, my father's brother, who lived in Madeira. This was the letter. Dear Mrs. Reed, please help me. I want to find my brother's daughter, Jane Eyre. I'm a rich man and I have no children. I want Jane Eyre to come and live with me. Yours sincerely, John Eyre. I read the letter and looked at the date on it. But Mrs. Reed, I said, this is an old letter. You got it 3 years ago. I know, she said, but I never liked you, Jane Eyre. After I read the letter I wrote to your uncle, I told him you were dead. I told him you died at Lowood School. Now go away. Leave me. Soon afterwards, Mrs. Reed died, and I returned to Thornfield Hall. It was summer, and the fields around Thornfield Hall were very quiet and beautiful. For me, it was the most beautiful place in the world. It was my home now.